are interested in, you may have been motivated in the academic sense as well. It feels, obviously you'd see making movie as a passion, and it's just like a hobby, right? In some ways, but the art history makes sense because film isn't art, and there's ways to learn how to do that art effectively. There's a history to it, and there's the way in which movies being expressed has rapidly changed given technology as well. So you obviously probably felt that kind of passion to go and learn about that aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
And then architecture, obviously the Bartlett's known for it. That would have been the avenues they were involved in.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, and I'm not that knowledgeable of film. I know I have many friends who are, film scholars or film critics, and, they've seen everything out there. It's kind of not how I came to using film. It was more kind of this really interesting practice that opened up like some really fun, interesting questions and discussions that found a home in the university scene that I enjoyed. And again, like the Bartlett is it is a really great place in terms of bringing together people as well who's doing very different things, especially the PhD program I was on. People came with such a variety of backgrounds, from the history of art or architecture or sociology, or some are visual artists, obviously lots of architects. And then you kind of see that there are so many different ways of doing things and doing architecture, I think, which intrigues me. I never done an architecture degree, but I do have a very keen interest in the way that we experience the built environment, the way we talk about it, the way that's changed over time through history. And again, I mean, using the window as an example, which I looked at extensively, there's so many different ways and uses of, like, definitions and uses of the window throughout history. If you look at different artworks, or even in buildings, the way that some windows are supposed to let lots of light in, others supposed to kind of protect you more. And that's something that really intrigues me. And, poets that write about the window as a separation between life and death, or inside and outside.
I never thought I'd be excited to talk about windows.
Yes.
But I've got some good questions for you when it comes, because that, no pun intended, but it opened my eyes up as well to the window. Like, in architecture, we just plonk them onto elevations and whatnot, but there's a real kind of phenomenological basis to, windows, fenestrations, right? Openings, doors, anything. But we'll get onto that. But before we get there, the thing I wanted to ask is, so now we're in this kind of, we understand how you kind of got into film. There was an interesting notion that I realized through your work, which is sort of before the windows actually, is actually that architecture or space is the subject, as opposed to an actor or a person. And obviously there might be instances where people are present in those movies, but architecture most definitely, or space or matter in that sense, is definitely the subject of that piece of art or that piece of work. And that, for me, by the way, that's something I'm incredibly passionate about. And even this whole two worlds thing is based on that premise, that there's the internal world that we occupy, but then there's the external, and to kind of see how your consciousness can be reflected on matter is something I find really interesting, and what I hope to hopefully get more involved in the future. But it was the inherent sort of conscious qualities of space that I was getting from your work. So how space can actually be conscious in a way, or have a sort of level of consciousness within it. And then those evoke the concepts of place as well, because what's the difference between space and place? I mean, you've obviously applied something else to it, maybe a type of identity. And so we're literally talking about phenomenology here now, right?
Yeah.
So you must have been aware of that.
Oh yeah, I think that's a very keen observation. I think it's I mean, to me, how I came into looking at the windows, and the work that I've been doing over almost a decade has been looking at the life and work of a Norwegian architectural theorist called Christian Nobek Schultz, who's widely known for bringing phenomenology, especially Heidegger's phenomenology, into the field of architecture. And without, going too much into detail, I think what really excited me about his work was his attention to the way that architecture is local. It belongs to place, so it's kind of grounded in place, and that this is something the architect should think about when they're designing. And then in his most famous book, Genius Loci, Towards the Phenomenology of Architecture from 1980, he goes quite into details about what place is, what is the structure of place, what's the character of place, and the spirit of the place. And then he looks at specific places, cities, buildings, and kind of pick them apart a bit. And there's so much to say about Christian Nobek Schultz, and a lot of the work that I do is also quite critical of his work. There's sometimes he does kind of create a bit too close connection between identity and place. And in a world today where so many people are traveling on the move, voluntarily or involuntarily, I think it's a bit risky to create that kind of too close bond between people and place.
What would example be?
In terms of what he suggests as too close, I mean, one of the things he writes in his book is that in Genius Loci is that Norwegians, as like a people, because the nature is so rugged and there's so many microstructures, we're very isolated and like not very sociable. And then also that we love the snow. And if you don't love the snow, you kind of don't belong in Norway. And I think that's definitely not the way I look at a nation or an understanding of nation. And that becomes like a difficult kind of political issue, I think. But yeah, so these are some of the things that I'm a bit more critical of.
He was kind of applying the identity of place too much onto actual people.
Yeah. And I mean, this was written in the 70s. A lot has happened since then. But I think it's worth kind of looking at that and kind of like acknowledging that, okay, that maybe this isn't something we should kind of bring forth in today. But that there's still some really interesting aspects of the way that he approached architecture and place that people use today, and that could bring some really interesting architecture forth. And he talks about drawing, for example, for architects, like how architects draw as a way of articulating place. And that's the way you kind of go into and use them, engage with, I guess, that's a better word, engage with the place, and includes aspects of life and everyday life. And I think back to then your question about kind of how filmmaking could be a way of addressing or like kind of engaging with these ideas, is there's definitely ways for architects to use film as a drawing tool. Obviously in terms of 3D modeling, but there are other ways of using the moving image, the time-based medium that it is, to show maybe how these like drawings come together and evolve and develop, which I think is interesting.
100%. But we don't see that often. I mean, like the way you're describing it, and like I'm kind of having this realization that like we've got the star architects of today, and they've got they've got their individual style that someone might look at a building or a drawing and be like, oh yeah, that's definitely a, you know, Frank Gehry building or Frank Gehry drawing, or Corbusier did these kind. But surely film would be an incredible addition to that tool set. I imagine those architects also had a particular style of film. Now that to me sounds a lot more true to architecture as well.
Yeah, and I think when you most of those large firms, they do have websites with and do have media departments. And I spent some time looking at the films that many of these media departments kind of make, and I think way too often the films, at least that comes out to the public, they try too much to kind of sell the project, if you know what I mean. They use techniques, for example, as like movement through the building, kind of this like you flow through the building, and it does kind of show the building, but I think there are a lot of other ways to kind of delve deeper into like how can moving images actually like enhance architecture, help us look at plays, and there are some great people out there who are really doing this. One of my go-to articles is by Penelope Haralambidou at the Bartlett, actually, who wrote an article called The Architectural Essay Film. And in this article, she asked these questions like, how can architecture, filmmaking be a design tool? So not just kind of representing what's already designed and ready, but really kind of use the film as a way of generating new ideas and exploring new aspects of architecture. And she particularly points to the way that film could bring up memory, different memories, through voices or through overlaying different images of the same space, how it's changed. It can bring up different like social aspects of architecture, how people engage in the space. We already talked about identity, but that's a big question. And then allowing kind of the new technologies, really exciting new technologies to be a part of that, I think is really, really interesting.
I think that's so powerful to be able to use film. Like, I can't imagine, you know, hearing that as a normal thing in universities where your tutor will say to you, okay, so you've done today's, you know, you've done this week's drawings, your tutorial went really well. Okay, so for the next week, you have to make a couple of films so that you can start to generate some new ideas. No, you'll never hear that. But, you know, now I'm starting to think for my own design projects, like, is there ways I can use movie to generate design ideas? I'm sure there are, because, you know, you talked about sort of memory, and I think I'm obviously interested in this stuff for a reason, and it's because I was writing about similar things. One of my first dissertations I wrote was on I actually used my house as a setting to experience memories through different senses. So it was based on the works of Gaston Bachelard, who wrote The Poetics of Space. I'm sure a lot of architecture students will know that. And he basically theorized, or kind of his point, and, you know, I believe he was the first to kind of come up with these theories. Obviously they must have been influenced by others, but that your house is a living kind of database of your memories. So your memories are embedded within that space, so much so that it's not just like a thing that exists within your head, but they're actually there as matter. So you might go and stand on a specific tile in your kitchen that you used to grow up. You know, every time you would walk into that kitchen as a kid, you remembered, oh, the tiles are really cold. And suddenly, as a grown-up, you're walking through the same kitchen and your feet touch the tiles, and you're like, suddenly you're a 5-year-old kid, you know, thinking similar things, and that's what we call nostalgia, right? But this is a kind of theory to express that your memories are embedded within that tile, for example. So it makes sense. It makes sense that you can use these ways to think about your project or your design, and it doesn't necessarily have to be on paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be on computer. Surely we should be looking at different ways to generate design. So 100%.
And I think, I mean, adding to that, I think another thing that's really important to stress is that the filmmaking equipment doesn't have to be extremely complicated. I sat in on the course. Last year I was a fellow at the Harvard Film Study Center, and I sat in on the course there where all of the students were using iPhones to make films, and the films were screened in a large cinema. Amazing. At the end of term, and with a very simple microphone and some apps that helps you kind of adjust some of the settings. Your phone can do a lot, and that's also a way that makes the filmmaking process a lot more accessible.
What would be a way to, let's say you grab your iPhone, and because I'm trying to think, what would be a way to actually use film to generate design ideas? Because you could, in the way we described that, let's say your project is to come up with a new house or come up with a new domestic dwelling, which is actually something I'm looking at. Obviously one of the most important things people do as architects is to go and do site research. You have to go and really investigate your site. I'm starting to feel that actually that might be the point at which you could use film in a really effective way, where you do your site analysis, and of course you would do that through photographs, through, usually when you do site analysis, you would make existing drawings and just mark on what the landscape has and whatnot and make some notation. But to actually have a film, I feel like that could be a really good point of way of using film to generate ideas.
Yeah, I think without claiming that this particular project led to any design ideas, because I'm not a designer, but I think one of the films that I made called the Norwegian Institute in Rome, it's based on a site visit that I made to the Norwegian Institute in Rome in 2016. And it has an extension that was designed by Christian Obekschul. So that's kind of how I got interested in the building. And during that site visit, I did two things that are quite common in terms of how you engage with the history of a building. I did archival research, so I looked at the drawings and old photographs of the building, letters, correspondence, and what happened in the process. And then I also conducted an interview with a woman that knew the history of the building extremely well. She partly grew up in the building. Her name is Else Lorang. She's the daughter of one of the founders.
She grew up in that building.
So her father was one of the founders, and when it was when the Norwegian Institute eventually moved into this building, it actually housed not only students and the library, but it also housed the two kind of co-founders lived there with their families. So
and this was your PhD?
That was part of my PhD, yes.
And the death of the chemist?
Yes, so that's another of the films that was part of my PhD project, which I'm actually currently, it's really exciting. I'm doing a screening of these two films and another one in Oslo in January. So that will be fun. But yeah, the death of the chemist, it looks at the death of Christian Obekschul's father, who died in 1926. He was a chemist and he was working at the university building in Norway and he went up on the roof to fetch some snow. And he slipped and fell through a window and died. And he was only 28 years old and leaving his pregnant wife behind. The son, then Christian Obekschul, never get to meet his father. And I think both of these projects, I use archival material as a way of exploring, kind of as a way of background. But one of them I also include archival images into the film, and creates like a link through a shot of the building from a roof terrace. And
before you get onto that, I want to tell you how I interpreted that movie, because I want to see it, because obviously there's openness to it, right? So I want to see if you achieved what. Let's just see what I thought. So
go ahead.
Before you get into it, I felt when I watched it, so obviously I didn't understand the conversation because it was in Norwegian, but I don't think that necessarily meant I couldn't follow. So on the left of the screen, you've got the archival plan drawings. So I noticed a few things that I found really interesting. Like, it was the idea of the kind of the old and the new. For me, that's what stood out. Specifically, I felt like they at one point they integrated, and I didn't make that connection. And actually, at the beginning, I was a bit confused. I was like, there's like seems to be this kind of webcam footage on the right of. First, I thought it was a still. I didn't think it was moving, and then you start to see the leaves moving a little bit, and you're like, oh, okay, this is video. And then obviously you've got the plans slowly changing on the left. So I'm quite fascinated by that language anyway. It sounds quite cool. So I was listening to the Norwegian. It's Norwegian, right?
Yes, it is.
So I was listening to that, and there was one point. So two people appeared on the right side, which, because it looked like live webcam footage, I wasn't kind of making that connection. And it was looking at this kind of beautiful new house. I instantly, as soon as those people walked out, I connected. I started to connect the plans to the actual exterior view of the house, which to me I thought they were obviously not connected. There's nothing to do with each other. But because all my attention was on these old drawings, and I attributed the audio to that because it was the only thing moving, suddenly it's like an unveiling of like, oh, actually they're connected to this even more so than that, actually. So suddenly you're like, oh, these things are the same. And what caused that connection was this kind of transition of audio into visual. Suddenly the voices became the people. So for me, that's what really stood out to me. And it was suddenly I've attributed visual identity to this house. So I don't know if that was your intention, but
I think that's such a nice way of talking about the film. There's definitely like 3 ways of watching this film.
Right.
And I mean, for those who haven't seen it, it's the first 13 minutes. It's just like one shot from the roof terrace, and then on the other side there's these plans going through each of the floors of the building. And after 13 minutes, eventually the people who's been walking through the building that you've been listening to, they walk into the terrace, and you suddenly, as you say, like have this connection, and then they talk a bit more. They, me included, I'm one of the people, and then up onto continues through the building. And I think there's 3 ways of watching it. It's without subtitles if you know Norwegian, and you can just kind of watch and listen. There's the possibility of watching it with an English subtitle, where you kind of read and listen and watch the 2. And it's been really interesting to hear people doing that, because it takes them even longer to realize it's not a still from the roof terrace, because they constantly move between the subtitle and then it's the way you watch it, which I'm always like so fascinated with, because obviously that way it's so accessible to me because I do know Norwegian and I made a film. But I think that's also a good way of watching it, because I don't know if you noticed, like the acoustics kind of slightly changing a bit.
I felt like, because it felt like as you walked into a room, was the plan changed for that room? Am I right?
It's each floor.
That was each
floor.
Okay.
But even so, that's great. And then if you do get that kind of like strong effect, I think, of the people walking into the frame. And then suddenly like the the voices get like a body. But I'm so glad. I never thought about it that way. But actually, that's also maybe a very clear point of making the connection between, as you say, like the present and the people of 2016 who walk, and then the plans and the original ideas of the architects that dates back to the 60s. And I mean, returning to your initial question, and I think including that like site visit alongside archival material is a good way to explore just like different temporalities of this building. It brings up the different people's experiences who live there, and shows the building in a different way, through the sound, through the moving image, and through the stills. I think in terms stills of the plans, the scanned plans.
Amazing, yeah. It's like, I think because maybe because I study architecture, I love the plans, so I'm like fascinated by the plans themselves. But I also think, and I don't know what your intention was in this, or whether you kind of left it open, is it wasn't immediately kind of obvious that those plans were attributed to that house. So for me, when you say that it was the reason that old and new stood out to me is because I instantly looked at those plans and knew and thought they were old, because I think obviously the color of them and the way that it was all hand drawn, and you know, maybe some people may look at plans and not know that, but the actual house, it was from that angle you couldn't really tell how old it was. So I think that's when the connection was a bit more profound, that whether you chose that angle specifically or I don't know.
Oh, that's nice.
It was good.
Yeah.
It was powerful.
Oh, that's really nice, actually. I haven't thought about it that way, but it's true. It does. Like my initial plan was to try and find a place close by and film kind of the whole building, but far away and like from above, and just close to this. The Norwegian Institute in Rome is the American Academy in Rome, and that is slightly taller. And I did get access to their roof terrace, but the logistics of it was just too complicated in terms of like getting power to the camera, having the camera there, and kind of moving through. It would have been a larger project logistically. And then I started thinking about, you know, my interest in the window, and there's a very large panorama window and the roof terrace, and then also the fact that it does kind of create like cropped view. Like it's not like, as you say, you don't see the entire city of Rome. I could have aimed it towards the city, showed kind of from the interior and out, or yeah.
What also kind of came up as a theme, and now it's all kind of clicking together, is, and I don't know if this was your intention, I'm just observing, voyeurism seems to be a very key thing in this, especially given that it is a window that you're kind of investigating. Now, windows are used for being voyeuristic, but especially I think the if we were to describe the most profound thing of these movies I've seen of yours, it is this kind of feeling of voyeurism. And again, with this audio visual connection, it was like this whole time you're eavesdropping on a conversation, you kind of feel like, okay, am I kind of like spying on this conversation? And then suddenly you're like, oh, boom, you get a visual cue, and you're like, okay, now I'm not just listening in on a conversation, I'm now visually spying on these people, because they don't acknowledge the camera. It's not like they come up to the camera like, hi. It's like they're still far away. They don't pay any attention to the camera, and I feel like that voyeuristic thing is really strong and powerful thing as well.
Yeah, and it's such a big part of the work that I do. It's an incredibly strong link, actually, between the architectural window and the camera. when it comes to this idea of looking and creating a frame, creating a view, framing a view. I mean, some of the very first photographs from like the 1820s are of windows. And one of the reasons that, they are of windows is that photographers also quite often worked in their studios to do their experiments, and photography needs light, so you were dependent on light, and just photographing the window, which was the natural light source, was then it was an obvious way of doing that. And then a historian called Karen Hellman, she's been arguing then that it's not just this like natural precondition of the photographic process that creates the link, but it's how we then later has come to understanding more symbolically how the camera frames the view, how the window frame views, and again, there's a long history as well in film criticism about what does it mean that we go into these dark spaces and sit and watch people. So that's such a nice link. And I think the way that I, for example, use radio microphones, these wireless technologies where you have like a small I used a small transmitter that's connected with a wire on the body of the person speaking. And then that signal is sent wirelessly to a receiver that's closer to a recorder. It creates mobility for the people who are speaking. Like, you don't have to think about the direction of where you're speaking or where the microphone is because you're wearing it. But additionally, wearing the microphone creates this incredibly intimate recording because you kind of forget that it's on you, and it's also like on your body, close to your voice, cords, and that's something I think works very well in this film, The Norwegian Institute in Rome, is that even when you are watching these two figures on the roof terrace and you connect the people with the voices, it's kind of odd that you're watching from a weird angle, but you hear so close the voices. And that's something I want to kind of continue to explore and work with.
That's amazing. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to do something quite sinister as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because obviously on the side, sinister films are obviously really well received, and they usually are really good. Some of the best movies ever made are horror or thriller, or I asked about the Joker as well. Like, Joker was one of the best movies I've seen. Honestly, it's just incredible. And there's a little thing I wanted to show you as well later about the Joker, but we'll get on to that. But even again, this is quite a private admission that when I was a kid, I was scarred quite badly by watching a horror movie. I was really young, and I watched The Exorcist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I don't know why I was allowed to do that, and I don't know why I stayed in that room watching it, but it messed me up. It messed me up for years. Like, I couldn't sleep properly, and what I attributed to the bed was horrible to me. So even like the shape of a bed, like, because the bed in the movies it's where all the crap goes on. The bed for me was like, I hated the bed. And then also the window. If you think about even The Exorcist, the front cover, if you look at the front cover,
it's a window.
It's a window. And it's a window which is open, which is letting, where the cold air is coming in and going out. And, what a way to scar people by, putting the most benign things and letting them get, like, now I never want to open my window when I sleep, so I boil. I'm okay now. This is before.
That's good.
So we're good now. But it's interesting how you can then attribute those horrors to the objects. And it doesn't necessarily have to be horrors. I could have had an incredible experience with a window or a bed, and suddenly what you attribute to that actual object or space you wouldn't expect to do that, but they're important as well.
I mean, that makes me think about. I'm here in London through like this EU mobility exchange called iPortness, and I'm here working on a project with a good friend of mine. Her name is Abby Palmer, and she's written a brilliant book called Sanatorium, which is about and it's coming out. Well, it's coming out in 2020. So, and I've come over to kind of engage with her work through filmmaking, and that's what we've been doing this week and next week. Yeah. And the whole book is about her experience of living with disabilities in the UK. With physical disabilities that needs to be treated through medication, but also through hydrotherapy. So she writes about spending some time in a spa facility in Budapest, and receiving treatment like physiotherapy and water and so on. But also she writes about her inflatable bathtub in a flat here in London, and how she's like trying to manage like her chronic pain and condition in this like wobbly inflatable, and it brings together these like brilliant ideas of what it means to kind of be affected by a space, by climate, by the way that it's designed.
Right, I can see the link now with even what we were doing at the architecture beyond sight.
Oh, definitely. There's so much great to be done and said about disability and architecture. But what you said made me think of was that I've been thinking a lot about the bathtub in talking to Abby, but also in kind of thinking about like how visually we can engage with her poetry and her book, where there's a lot of ideas about floating. Kind of like the being elevated and kind of the freedom that comes with floating, but also the overwhelming feeling of being covered in water as well. And maybe then using some of these techniques that we've been talking about, but applying them to filming the bath and the bathtub, which is a room, a space that many people, we use them every day, and they're quite like private spaces. But I mean, so many horror movies.
Yeah.
People get killed in bathrooms. Yeah. I mean, Psycho is one great example.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like if you were to make a catalogue of the kind of objects or spaces that get used in horror movies, I think that'd be a really interesting thesis. I'm sure other people could think of, I mean, elevators are an interesting one as well, because stuff always happens in an elevator, but that's quite obvious because an elevator is a confined space and it's a machine and you're totally embodied by four walls of metal. So, but things like a bathtub, like why and how did that end up in mainstream horror? And it's all really interesting.
Yeah, and that brings up like all of these like questions about like the home and what we're worried about and scared of. That's true. I guess like starting with Hitchcock is a great place to start. I mean, he definitely used windows. Rear windows is a great example, but so many great inventive ways of using architecture as a way of concealing and then suddenly revealing and keeping that momentum. I think is great, and that's again like back to your initial questions about how can film be a way of thinking about design, or designing is also think about if you film something, what you choose not to film and what's outside of the frame could also be really powerful.
What you don't show.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's like the narrative and the subliminal plot is really important for your type of film as well, because you don't have the ease of a person reading through a script. Those narratives have to be built in other ways, and usually the way those narratives are the most powerful is if the viewer is coming to those conclusions themselves. And you see that, and I think that's what I wanted to show you with the Joker as well, is when the environment and the space can be suggestive, it's then the subject, it's a horrible way of saying it, but the viewer, the occupier, is then convinced that it's their own experience, and therefore they have a much more stronger experience. Since we're on this topic, I wanted to share with you something that happened with me just yesterday, and I didn't make the link, but when I was looking into your work, I was like, oh my god, this is totally linked to it. And it was on the 12th, so yesterday I voted, obviously, in the election, and as I was walking back, so it was the evening, and I live in Tunbridge Wells, and I was walking down a street where quite well-off houses, and people are doing well on this street, but obviously Christmas lights are coming up, and it was just really nice treat to see all the amazing, beautiful mansions with their crazy lights already outside, and how every single one was different. But one thing I realized is, usually with those kind of newly furbished old Victorian type houses, they have quite a strong kind of window facade at the front, these big giant Victorian windows. And so what I noticed was, actually I was judging each house and how nice it was, and I was specifically looking through their windows, and it's such a weird thing for me to make that connection, but I know for a fact that I felt good feelings towards some of those houses and slightly less good feelings. And what I was observing actually was framed views inside the house. So every house I walked past, I was looking at the windows, wasn't looking at anything else, and I was getting glimpses, layers of the architecture and the space inside, framed by various different styles of lighting. Some of them were much more subtle, some of them were going all the way across the house, some of them were, some of the spaces inside were lit. But it's a very difficult thing for me to describe, I'm realizing now, but every frame I looked through was giving me a different feeling. And I don't know whether because some of them, it almost felt like looking through the window I could see almost nothing, or it would go on into another window in the back of the house and it was dimly lit. But something about some of the houses made me feel a little bit unsafe, or I wouldn't want to go in there. But then some of these houses, I don't know why, again, maybe it was the way they were lit, maybe it was the colors, or maybe it was the layering of things I could see, I could identify, but I felt like, whoa, I'd love to go in that house. So I don't know how that relates to what you've been looking into.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that would be a brilliant thesis, wouldn't it? Just kind of, you could bring up so many questions about wealth, and even the amount of lighting and how much it costs, like who puts lighting up, who doesn't. But also how the window does give a glimpse of the people living inside, and the everyday lives of those people, which I think that's something that really interests me. I'm currently now, just this week, I signed the contract for a job. Yes, yeah. So I'll be one of 3 researchers on a project called Disobedient Buildings, and it's such a great project. It's looking at how certain blocks of flats, certain architectures that was built a while back with welfare and kind of well-being in mind, now are aging, and how people live in these buildings and kind of take care of them, or kind of negotiate the aging of the buildings today. So the 3 of us will look at a different country. There's one researcher looking at the UK, and seeing how certain of blocks of flats then in the UK has been aging and how people are tackling and handling that. There's one researcher working on the Romania, and then I'll be working on a Scandinavian example, and we will all be using film as a tool to really work with the people who live in the building, and you know, thinking of what you just said, you know, maybe some of the films that I make or an aspect of that will look at the building from the outside and catch these like glimpses of life. Maybe play with radio microphones or other ways of getting that like really like the intimate feeling of the people living, but still kind of that distance, like your view is distant, but thinking if you would have walked down that street with like headphones and just being able to kind of switch between the channels and suddenly like hear directly, you know, what's going on inside. Is someone maybe playing music or they're talking or there's just like silence. I mean, that would have enhanced your experience.
I mean, it definitely speaks to the whole voyeuristic thing as well, that as I walked past each house, it was like I realize now I was looking to get glimpses of what was going on inside. And I think that's just natural anyway, when people walk past things where there happens to be openings or transparent aspects to it, they will feel like maybe, oh, what's inside there? So yeah, it was a strange one.
And I mean, I think in how then that might be interesting or relevant to architects. I think that it really can show you what people who then live and use the buildings, how they appropriate the space or use the space, and in a way that is important for the architects to think about. And hopefully then this, I really think that the Disobedient Buildings project will bring forth some really interesting perspectives and voices and views on how people live in buildings that might have been built for a certain purpose, and now the lives of the people living there are completely different, or maybe not so different.
But why is it called Disobedient?
In terms of like thinking about that the buildings themselves, or this is kind of my interpretation, I think of it as the buildings are disobedient to maybe either the original design idea, or they're disobedient to the process of time, like they're aging, or they're not aging the way you might think they would, or maybe disobedient in terms of what the current political climate are expecting them to be, or want them to be. I mean, the way we, especially in the UK, the way we build council flats, for example, has changed a lot, and the current political climate are definitely not prioritizing perhaps as much.
What's happening in politics now?
I don't know. Was it an election yesterday?
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So
no, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
There's many ways that could be a disobedient thing.
Yeah.
The one about it maybe disobeying its original function, that I love that, because then again, back to the vernacular thing. Vernacular is that, right, the organic evolution of things, right? So it's kind of stepping out of the box and saying it's not what it was originally intended to be. It is whatever it needs to be. So that, yeah, when are we going to see the fruits of that project?
Oh, hopefully. It's a 3-year project.
Right. Research mainly, right? And then film.
Yeah, research. And it will all end in, all the 3 of us will work with film. So we'll produce films, but then it would also be result in an exhibition the PI of the project, Inge Daniels, at Oxford, she was involved in this brilliant exhibition, the Japanese House at the Barbican, right, like 3-4 years ago, where they she, as an anthropologist, went into like the Japanese a set of Japanese homes, observed them, and kind of engaged with the people living there for a certain amount of time, and then back at the Barbican, like rebuild 1-to-1 scale replicas of those homes, and put those homes into like this strange gallery context. And the project will then result in a similar exhibition, right, where you bring these disobedient buildings, these aging buildings, and the people who've been living there, bring them into the gallery space. And I think that has such a great potential in terms of reaching other audiences that also film has. I think academics, we definitely need to find new ways of sharing our work, and not stay, closed in our universities. Podcasts are great.
Well, also, if you need any assistance in generating visuals or models, I'm happy to help.
Yeah.
Keep me updated in that project. But back to your PhD, because it's described as a fenestral essay film, right?
Yeah.
But fenestral, I like that word, fenestral.
Yeah. One of my other favorite words is defenestration. That means throwing people out of windows.
Does it?
Yeah. And there's like two great events in history. The first and the second defenestration in Prague, where this whole kind of political uproar, they threw people out of windows.
Wow.
But yeah.
So Schultz's father was defenestrated.
I don't think you're defenestrated if you fall through a window kind of as an accident, if you fall and slip. I think kind of if you defenestrate someone, I think they're kind of forcefully thrown.
Right.
And I think I call these films fenestral essay films because they engage with some very specific features of the architectural window that also kind of are seen in the way we talk and think about film. And those are like framing, mobility, and self-reflection are kind of these three key terms.
Even in vocabulary, right? The term a window, I'm going to give you a window to something.
Yeah.
It's there's so much to that word. But I'm going to read you a quote, see if you can recognize it. So, the window is an architectural element which relates to the human needs of air, light, and view. But through its frequent and varied use as a multifaceted concept and metaphor, its meanings go far beyond its physical, spatial definition and can involve notions of insight, transition, framing, or even the photographic process. So that's from your PhD. The thing I wanted to kind of focus in on was when you said its frequent and varied use as a multifaceted concept and metaphor, and that's what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
In terms of architecture specifically, how that manifests in the design sense, the one thing that stood out to me was obviously almost two windows are never the same. Unless you're using Velux kind of copy and paste windows, which usually you would, because from my experience in an office, you want to kind of, you just get the windows specified by a conglomerate company who do all the glazing and everything. But in some of the more bespoke projects, and with these guys as well, they can do bespoke windows. But if we were to say drawings, right, two windows are never the same. Some of them are long, giant, really, really long width-wise. Some of them are full wall glazed. I was just trying to kind of apply that to how windows are varied in actual architecture physically.
Oh, that's such a good question.
Because you could make a register of windows, right?
Yeah.
And that could be another research project.
That could be another research project. I think there's one book that I really, really love by Anne Friedberg, and it's called The Virtual Window, From Alberti to Microsoft. And it literally looks, yeah, it's great. It looks at the window from...
What's his name again?
Anne Friedberg.
So
Anne, A-N-N-E. Yeah. F-R-I-E-D-B-R-G. Yes. And she's so she starts with Alberti, who's like a Renaissance theorist in many ways, who wrote about the painting and the canvas of the painting. He wrote that it should be like a window into another world, something like that. And he was referring to like Renaissance perspective. In terms of like if you paint, you really, it should have like follow the rules of Renaissance perspective to make it look like the world. But then she is making the argument that windows in the Renaissance, they actually weren't like, they were translucent, but they were not really transparent, because the way they were made at that point were just like, they're too rugged and they're handmade and even like quite rare to have windows. You know, the windows that we are used to, they're a product of, you know, modernity.
You walk through them.
Yeah. And so those windows were completely different. And then she uses kind of that specific architectural window as a way of like rethinking what Alberti was saying. It's a fascinating read. And she goes like through history all the way then up to, you know, Microsoft, and how the way that we think about screens and interface design just builds upon and derives from so many ways of thinking about framing and
our phones and our laptops.
Yeah.
TVs.
They're all windows.
They're windows into different realities.
Yeah.
Wow.
And another great example that I found in the work of Beatrice Colomina, in her, I think the book is called The Media House. And she looks at the architectural design of Corbusier and Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos was kind of around the turn of the century, and his windows were quite relatively small. And she also writes about how like the fireplace was kind of like the center of the house, like the interiors are all like centered inwards. And then Le Corbusier comes with kind of his take on modernity, and he just like opens it up and have like long horizontal windows that kind of lets light in. There's a different connection between inside and outside. And she sees that in connection with the way that mass media kind of exposes private life in a new way. And again, like back to your question, like how does it, the actual design then, the technology of allowed windows to be large, suddenly expose private life. And then that kind of took part in like cultural change where, you know, today we're all like, you know, doing podcasts, filming things, or, you know, on reality TV or Snapchatting everything we do. So it's a very fascinating discussion, I think. I mean, through my PhD and looking at the windows, it became clear that like coming into the windows and phenomenology, it did open up this huge question about what is like the body in space, or different bodies in space. And I did then become more and more interested in questions of disability, started reading disability theory.
The social model and then the medical.
Yeah,
model.
the social and the medical model. Think about like all our bodies, like how they change and respond to environments differently. and started then through my kind of postdoctoral work, especially the work I did at Harvard last year, really thinking about how if you start with a disabled body, how can maybe the architectural history that derives from that be different or bring up some new perspectives, which really, really intrigued me.
So almost like framing a different perspective of history through a different like embodiment.
And I think in my PhD, like as I mentioned, like one of the key terms of my thesis is self-reflection. Right. So in the thesis, I think a lot about what my position is as a researcher, what my position is as a follower of Christian Nobel Schultz, quite literally, because I traveled like through Europe in his footsteps, but also more kind of figuratively in the way that I kind of come after I revisit his work and like follows him in that way. And that allowed I used film as a way of kind of thinking about my own position. And then I think some of the conversations that kind of derived from that was that, okay, but what if you, after turning this camera inwards on yourself, how could it be used to look at the experiences of others? And I still use myself a lot in my work, but in it's more like an undercurrent rather than a straight up kind of self-portrait. Yeah.
I think that brings us on quite nicely to cleaning at Utzon.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes.
So I watched that and again, before you talk about it, I'm going to talk about it.
Go ahead.
Because I love that. That was, I think, one of my favorite ones. And that was quite recent, right?
It's recently. It was shot in 2017 when I had an artist residency at Jørn Utzon's villa Canli at Mallorca. And you should all just go and Google that because there are residencies open for international artists, architect, researchers. And you can apply and spend a month at Mallorca, which I did, which was brilliant.
So Google that, guys. And it's spelled Canlis.
Yes.
LIS is a different word. So first of all, I think what instantly stood out to me is obviously it was long. So I think it's like an hour and something long. And you are literally cleaning the windows for the entire time.
Yeah.
Now, for me, it was the rawest way of experiencing that space. But the building was beautiful as well, and it was a house. But whenever you'd showcase a beautiful house like that, you would do it in the way we're all used to seeing, which is you take your massive camera crew and they do this highly polished, almost superficial video of you going through the space. And the thing that really bugs me is when the architect's voice is kind of narrating, saying, and this is how you feel when you walk into this space, or, when you walk into the bedroom, you get an overwhelming sense of an openness because of the light coming in. And it's like, whoa, relax. They're now actually influencing how you feel. Whereas this was the complete opposite. It's like, you're gonna come up with your own interpretation of how you feel. And that instantly was amazing for me, because I was like, it's not lying to me. The architecture is not lying to me at all. And it was through your interaction with that building, through cleaning its windows, that I was having the kind of the rawest or the most true experience with that building. And like another few observations was like, there was moments where like the sponge fell off, I think at like halfway through. So you can tell I really watched this.
Yeah.
The sponge fell off the handle, and I was like, this is brilliant. And it was like that moment mixed in with, obviously throughout the whole video, I don't know whether it was intentional or I don't really care, but the fart like noises the squidgy was making on the windows, because as you imagine, you scrub a window, it's going to go or whatever. But that was the kind of predominant sound throughout. And so those two things, as well as everything else I'm describing, was really like, it was the most humble way of experiencing that building, and the most true. There's no lies being told. There's no one, injecting thoughts into your head of like, this is how you feel when you walk in this space. So that's my first kind of observations of that. And it on a side note, it actually also made me feel like all buildings should be showcased like that. Like, now I want to see that video with all of the great buildings, with someone just cleaning the window, and it could be something else, right? It could be, dusting it or something, or just doing something really benign. I think is such a powerful thing, especially with the way architecture is presented today. But then the other thing was, this kind of framing thing came to my mind, and I felt that there was a double framing going on in a way, because a double framing of experience where, one, the windows themselves, there were various different windows. They offered specific views, and sometimes we were behind it and you were on the other side. And again, really felt voyeuristic at moments in this, because it's so long as well. And I'm like, I've been watching her for so long, scrubbing windows.
Yeah.
I'm like, is this right? I don't know. But I'm like, okay, yeah, no, it's fine.
I was aware of the camera.
There you go. Yeah,
so
obviously you'd have to have been, but you were focused on your job, so that was
good, yeah.
But then there were other moments where like we're on the same side as you, so there was a psychological interplay there as well of like, oh, this feels less voyeuristic in a way because I'm in the same threshold, whereas when we were in different thresholds, it felt a bit more different. But that double framing was, one, the window, and then second was my PC. My computer screen was offering another. So again, I don't know if you intended those things, but that's how I interpret it.
Oh, that's great. I mean, again, like, it's such good comments and feedback, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's one of those projects that, like, it needs to be that long.
Yeah,
it really does. But it's also, I feel bad for the people. I don't not feel bad, but it's you need to have the time to actually sit down and watch it. I think there's something really nice. I mean, in terms of framing, it's interesting because I've been looking at windows for so long, and my supervisor Jane, whenever we would meet for my PhD supervision, she would say, I think almost always, she would say something about, oh yeah, it's all about framing. And I was like, yeah, it's all about framing. And I would write it down and then leave. And I was like, do I know what framing really is? And maybe it's because I'm not a native English speaker. And we have kind of a similar word for it. But I think in Norwegian, you would separate between kind of a framing. There's more. Yeah, I think I would separate between an understanding of framing as like the physical frame around something, and then almost like a cropped view, or like, do you know, like in the concept of framing in English, it kind of encompasses that someone frames it, like there's a frame. Maybe I never thought about it in Norwegian, and it just took me like 6 years living here to grapple with it. But it has some really nice potential in terms of using this frame to kind of think differently. And again, like obviously the way that your own computer screen kind of adds a frame, that's like your viewing condition. It's interesting. The other point you made, I think, about the building and bringing it kind of like down to earth was really important to me. And at that point, I shot it during the 4th week of my residency, so I already stayed in this building for 3.5 years. Years, I wish. Weeks. Let's say stay there. Yeah, that would have been nice.
Cleaning windows for a long time.
Yeah. And it was just like me and my partner. We were there. We had some friends visiting sometimes, but mainly it was just the two of us. So you do get into like an everyday routine in the building. And I think like watching it now, I think it comes off, and maybe that's something you're picking up on is how like comfortable I am in that space. Yeah. I was very much inspired by a really brilliant film installation, actually, project called The Kiss by an artist called Inigo Magnolo Ovalle. I can probably write it down and we could add it under the podcast. But it's shot at the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe. Oh, wow. And similarly, there's a window cleaner. I think it's the artist himself who's on the exterior, and he's cleaning. And I mean, that building is literally just like a glass box. It's all windows. And then in the interior, you have a DJ, a female DJ playing music. And in that film, going from the interior to the exterior shifts how what you actually hear. So in the interior, you hear the headphones, the music of the DJ, whereas on the exterior, you hear the squeaking of the tools against the window. And I did like play around a bit with how I wanted the soundtrack of my film to be. If I should do something similar, should I have like two different sources? And in the end, I ended up using the sound recorded from the interior throughout. So even if the image shifts, you still hear the interior sound. And I think I tried with like mixing it back and forth, and I think then I lost that kind of like, it's very a very even soundtrack. Yeah. And it blurs that line between inside and outside a lot, and that goes very well with this magnificent building and its windows that are almost like they're so invisible. And then like sometimes you don't even know if it's a window, and then suddenly you see the water and the sponge.
Yeah, no, my eyes were playing tricks on me at one point, I think, because it was such a clean window. Yeah, it almost was like, is there even a window there? Like, yeah. That's what happens when you watch it for so long. But there's like and I think it'd be interesting because you talk about the length of it being difficult for some people to watch, and I can see that because obviously, especially the way media is kind of given to us now, you want the quickest, way of absorbing information. It's almost a spiritual thing to sit there and watch that, because you have to really kind of be calm and collected and have the patience for it. Whereas now, like, everything's about speed with media and videos. The best YouTube videos are the ones that clickbait you in and then have like so many sensory, things going on. Yeah. Whereas a podcast like this, you have to really sit down and watch it. But it made me think, actually, I don't know what you think, that you see similar things in some movies, and I can't think of them, but I feel like it's a thing where there's a repetitive action which will keep happening in the movie, and only after it's happened like 3 or 4 times you realize, okay, this is something more subliminal now being suggested to me. Like I can't think of anything, but I can feel it's a thing where for example, a particular habit of the character might be an ongoing theme, and it might be the flicking or picking of nails, but you only realize it when he's or she's been doing it for the last 8 scenes, and suddenly you might realize, oh, the director wants me to feel something with this. But I also felt from your movie that repetition was obviously an important key part of it as well, because you could have done other things to that window, but you cleaned the crap out of them. But there obviously were a lot of windows, right?
Like there are 13, I think I'm cleaning, and they're absolutely enormous. I mean,
exactly, yeah.
They're very big.
Yeah. So it's almost like we wanted to see that job done.
And I have very basic tools, I must say, and probably skills as well. So that plays a role.
I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't feel like those movies might be for like the general consumer of movies, right? They're meant for academic reasons, obviously, purposes, and more artistic ones, right?
I think you're right. I mean, it's that particular film, Cleaning at Utzons. It's been accepted to the official selection at a festival in Palm Springs as part of the Modernist Week there in February. And I actually, when I got the notification, I also submitted another film. And for like 24 hours, like a day, I thought they selected the other film. And I was about to like send them all the material for the other film. And suddenly I was like, oh, wait, which one? And again, like I told my partner, I was like, what? They wanted to screen Cleaning at Utzon. He was like, the long film? It's like, it's too long. He's my harshest critic. Yeah. And then I was like, oh, that's so nice, because I think with the right setting, it can be a really good experience. It will be then screened in the cinema, which I think will be great. But even like in a gallery, like you walk through it and you can sit down and watch like 3 windows, or there's a nice thing actually about watching it from beginning to the end, in terms of watching how tired I think the body who is cleaning gets through this work.
The hair changes and everything.
Yeah, the hair changes, and
it's hard work. Yeah.
It's really hard work. So I mean, the film lasts for 54 minutes. 64 minutes, I think. But I mean, the recording of it took 4 hours, I think. Wow. With
So you know Shia Labeouf? Yeah. So he's done crazy things, like, like he did an elevator thing in Oxford. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
Wait, I think for 24 hours, it's one whole video for maybe 12 hours.
I think I heard of this.
Yeah, so they stayed awake in a lift in Oxford. It's on YouTube. You guys can search it. With 2 other people. I don't know if they were actors as well or famous people. But instead of going and doing fan meetups, he let people get in the lift with them, and they'd close the lift and they'd talk in the lift. Wow. For, he'd give them as long as they wanted, and they were just like, yeah, so what are you up to? Like, how's life been? And they just talk about the most benign things, and it's like, they've broken so many boundaries with the whole celebrity on a pedestal thing, and that, this Transformers guy, as people know him, or the Even Stevens guy, as people know him, their starstruckness was completely dissolved, because they were like, oh, now he's just the guy in the elevator with me.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's really powerful. So like the length of a particular video, I think your video also speaks to that as well, is like, if you let yourself be patient and experience that long process, there is a lot to get from that as well. Hopefully that's the aim with the podcast as well. They're meant to be around average 90 minutes, because this research showed that 90 minutes is enough time, the right amount of time for you to absorb information and be able to learn it in a kind of a more reliable way. And anytime less is too little, but anytime more, attention span starts to go.
Yeah.
So your video is actually not longer than 90 minutes.
No, that's true. I mean, I'm very inspired by there's a genre called slow cinema.
Okay.
And several people have been writing as well about like the slowness, the importance of slowness in film. But also the Norwegian phenomena of slow TV. So in the late, I can't remember the exact year. I think it might have been like 2009, around that time. The Norwegian National Broadcasting, they did a broadcast of the train from Bergen to Oslo. And it's 7 hours and 15 minutes, I think. And it just has like a small camera at the front of the train. Super basic kind of production. No particular soundtrack. I think on the broadcast they actually did kind of intercut a bit with some interviews or things like within the train. But the film that's now on YouTube, it's just like watching the train moving through these landscapes. And I watched it with a group of friends now, maybe like 3 years ago. And we just like came together and made food and watched it. And we were like so like engaged. We were just like watching this and just couldn't take our eyes off it. And we're just moving through these landscapes. And I remember one point, so there's a lot of tunnels on this route. And at some point it just like the train went into a tunnel and it just became black. And at that point, one of my friends arrived and was like, what's going on? Like, why are there like 10 people just watching this black screen? And then suddenly you saw like this tiny little light at the end of the tunnel, and everyone was like, oh, and then it opened up and it's this beautiful snow landscape, like snow-covered landscape. And it's really, I really like it.
I think there's another thing in that was on the news I saw. I think in China, there's like a new trend of hotels where they don't need payment for you to stay there, but they need you to record yourself 24 hours.
Wow.
So constant recording. So the perfect voyeuristic hotel. So you don't pay, you just have to sign something that says we're going to let people watch us all night, all day.
Wow.
And that's their form of payment because it's enough for them to obviously generate YouTube views and then finance it.
And I think that brings up a lot of questions as well about privacy and about how we think so differently about our privacy these days than before. And maybe we should be more critical, or quite frankly, we probably should.
Talk about it more as well. So especially with the way technology is going, because there are ways I think that we can become a bit maybe too lost in trying to enhance that immersiveness that people want to feel, and that risk is already at play.
And I mean things like the companies like Google owns this DNA test company.
Right.
I can't remember the name of it, but you submit your DNA
Is
and
it the
then
one you spit in?
Something like that, and then they
Ancestry or something.
it's not Ancestry. It's something else, but you submit it and then they send you back like, oh, these are the illnesses you might get, this is your heritage, but then in a way, like, who owns that information and who could use it? So a discussion that starts with a window, an architectural window, or the framing features of the film camera can definitely go in so many directions. And I think like these things, like we've been talking about today, the ideas of privacy, ideas of memory, ideas of like the horror genre we talked about at the beginning. A lot of these themes are things that I think many architectural students are interested in, should be interested in, should think about in their design. And that film could be a way of accessing that.
100%. And even, again, I think one thing I'm learning from you, and I think a lot of students can learn as well, especially given the fact that I know how many students are really interested in looking at new ways of representing their work and also being able to generate narrative. I think the Bartlett School of Architecture is also obviously very popular, and it's very famous for the kind of fantastical and fictional drawings in the way that students are able to generate these amazing narratives. And I've also had, because of some of the Instagram stuff, people ask like, oh, how do you do that particular drawing or not? And I learned a lot from Eric Wong, who was only episode 3 from this podcast. And we talked about the value of storytelling. And he was talking through how much effort he goes through in creating a particular drawing or a scene. And he's like, even the way you curve that, the grass blade would imply the wind is blowing in a certain direction, which would imply that particular seasonal effects. And it's like, what I'm getting from your work as well is the fact that the framing of a scene and a narrative is the architect's biggest aim, and the biggest endeavor is to be able to figure out how you frame an idea. And when it comes to drawing and representation, right? And then that has to then manifest in the physical world. But you only get there after being able to frame it successfully. So what I'm getting from all of this is to think about framing in not just the film sense, but even in your drawings, that you're creating a particular scene, a window into a narrative. It's incredibly important to probably consider the same thing someone would consider for film. And in your case, these architectural films are a great resource. And you can apply that to your own film, but you can also apply that to your drawing as well, right?
Yeah. And the way you frame things, also then in your drawings, or let's say framing could also be a way of thinking about the words you choose to use when you present your work. Then if you look at that also with, a critical lens, really thinking about, what does it mean that I talk about my project in this way and not the other way, could really be a way of thinking about what kind of ideologies might be present, what political ideas and systems are we dealing with here. Again, like if you represent your space with certain well-known figures in the drawings, again back to this discussion we had about disabilities, what is the presence of a disabled body in space compared to an architectural space that seems to be designed for a normal body, whatever normal might be. I mean, that's something to also maybe think about in terms of the projects that we 100%. Do.
And the one thing I love about these podcasts is there comes a point where I'm like things are clicking and I'm like making these connections, and it's the kind of lessons I want to take away from speaking to people like you. It's like I can see how all of these things link into the way that architects and architecture students need to present their work as well. And you talked about this concept of even the way you frame your work. You think you know your work. If you were to switch that and frame it in a different way, is incredibly powerful. And I can see exactly what you're saying. It's like if you were allow yourself to have an open frame or an open window to what these things could be, you allow so much more in. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a much more rich concept, and you start to understand it a lot more. Whereas if you're stuck in one frame or one way of interpreting something, it's very you restrict yourself from what it truly is. And that's what I again got from your work of with these films, is it's suggestive, but it's not forcing you to feel or see or interpret the building or space or person or life in a particular way. And I think that's so powerful. And if we were to master that, or if we were able to play with that more, of how you can become more suggestive as a designer and not forceful, of like saying, here is a grey brick wall or beautiful stucco render, and this is how you feel when you see it. No, we should embrace a more kind of
complexities.
Right.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I think we hear a lot is people with very good intentions, students and practitioners who say, you know, this project, we're engaging with such and such community, for example, or we're engaging with this group of people or the general public. The space is open to everyone and they can all come in and engage with it, for example. And then you start like picking it apart a bit and ask like, okay, but who are this general public that maybe have access to the space? And maybe it's like, oh, it's designed in a way that it's very approachable to you because you know all the codes and the ways that this kind of space might function. But someone coming from a completely different point of view might not even, you know, go into this and use the space. And there are a lot of unused, unsuccessful public spaces in many cities and areas. And then you have other areas that was, you know, they thought of it in a completely different purpose, but then it's been appropriated and used differently. I'm bringing up this because I think quite often then when you then again like frame your work, really think about, you know, you have a position, like you have a point of view that you bring into it, and that's like a valid, important point of view, like always, but it might not be like the general, like everyone won't really feel the same way. And again, the project we did with Disordinary Architecture at the Bartlett, the Architecture Beyond Sight project, it really, I think for all of us, just shifted the way that it was like, oh, you know, we might have good intentions in so many ways, but this isn't inclusive design. This isn't really what we intended.
You know, one thing that kept coming in my mind during that workshop was I was questioning why our spaces don't start at a point of being inclusive as opposed to what generally happens where you kind of throw all that stuff on at the end. And it seemed obvious that actually, okay, the key decision makers who are behind, you know, the development of cities and buildings and whatnot, and they obviously make this assumption and actually the judgment that majority of people are not disabled. There's disabled or people with special needs are minorities. And when they think of people with disabilities or special needs, they're thinking of, okay, blind, deaf, maybe some sort of you know, mental things or whatever. They have a specified kind of terms of what they think is disabled or special needs. I mean, a lot of the work I'm looking at as well at the moment is, and what the stuff we were exploring in that workshop was the social model of disability, which says that people are disabled not by their physical or inherent problems with their body or whatever you want to say, but actually it's society and the environment which disables people. And when you look at it that way, it's a very fluid and dynamic thing that many different types of people are disabled and have special needs. And an example of that is a woman in a pushchair who comes to a set of stairs. Suddenly she's disabled and suddenly she has special needs because there's no elevator or no other interesting machine that can help her get the pushchair up to the top. So it's proof that the way we have designed our environment is non-inclusive. So I think that was another interesting thing to think about here. And the link between that and your work, if you were to summarize that, of how your work is linked to disabilities, how would you describe that?
I mean, I'm really happy that you describe my work as suggestive, because it's something I really aim for. I mean, suggestive or ambiguous. I quite often feel like I'm approaching themes that I keep like shifting my position. Like, I don't know, Norberg Schultz is a good example. Reading his work as an undergrad student, I thought it was fantastic. I swallowed it, and this is, you know, brilliant. He's just describing everything we need to know about our world and architecture and everything. I came to the Bartlett, and I was kind of equipped with this like critical framework that started thinking, oh wait, but maybe there are some things that aren't as good about his work. And then eventually I started looking for ways of allowing this like ambiguity to exist, basically, and I found the essay form. We kind of just talked about it without kind of defining it, but the essay form is exactly a genre in both film and writing that allows the author to include their own personal experience. Quite often begins with like a personal point of view, or allows a personal point of view in the writing. It includes a lot of references from other thinkers, artists, scholars. And then through certain kind of techniques manages to move, like leap between this material in a way that doesn't offer like a conclusion. The essay in French, it comes from the word trial or attempt. So it's like this figure, this person who's trying and attempting to articulate something or say something or convey an idea, and then it's in that way it's supposed to be like a conversation with the reader or viewer, that maybe these things come together. So it's more like opening a discussion rather than kind of being didactic and presenting a finished thought, I think. And that's something I found really fruitful in terms of exploring disability in architecture. My work has focused more on chronic kind of inflammatory illnesses, rheumatic illness, chronic pain conditions. And I think a lot of the discussions that kind of derives from that discussion, and again, like back to the work of Abby Palmer, with whom I'm working now, a lot of the discussions we have with about how the body kind of react and respond to architecture has to do with, it's not clean cut. It's always kind of like, sometimes it might be a very pleasant interaction with the space, other times it's not working, and finding tools and genres and ways of engaging with that ambiguity, I think, is something I'm really keen to do